thank you for indulging us in naps and nap talk and nap chatter. The titles, of course, for our... Brian's going like this. The titles, of course, are really for our families and kids. We're leaning into that for Lent. We're hoping that there are simple ways where we can connect deeply with Jesus on his journey to the cross in ways that remind us that he is deeply human. He got lost. He got tired. His body is not so unlike our bodies. It may seem strange, but I have run across and know many parts of Christianity that make Jesus out to be sort of a floating ethereal angel, right? Like Jesus didn't actually do physical things on earth, as if he didn't live with a real body and a real experience of humanity. And I think it's dangerous theologically to what I call over-spiritualize Jesus. I know that's a weird term to use for the Son of God, but go with me on this. It's as if Jesus didn't react in ways that we might understand that we would react as well in situations. As if being tired isn't spiritually unhealthy, right? If you're tired, maybe you've done something wrong. As if being afraid isn't a part of the human experience. And so there's two emotions going on here in the story. They were afraid, and you can tell that Jesus is a little bit frustrated, right? He doesn't get up and just rebuke the storm and then let it go. He goes, why do you have so little faith? What's going on for you? As I introduced this, I reminded us that it's one of the few stories in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. And we should ask ourselves, of course, why? What does this story in particular tell us about Jesus or our faith that is meaningful as we connect to Jesus during Lent? And so our title is both funny and informative. Yes, Jesus takes naps. And I can tell you that when I was little, I did not like taking naps. I had a real FOMO situation as a kid, fear of missing out. When I was a kid, as you can probably be shocked by, I was a bit of an extrovert. I was the one who got in trouble for talking too much in class. Raise your hand if that was you. Just me? Okay, good, few of us. And so napping meant I was missing out. Now, we get older, we have to be careful of naps because we also have to go to bed at night and sleep and want to sleep through the night, and there's all that to gauge. But if I could get a good nap in as an adult, thank you, right? How many found naps later in life where you're just like, I'm going to give myself permission to just rest a little bit right now? And Jesus did take a nap. That's a reasonable assessment of the story in this situation. Jesus getting them all in a boat was maybe his only way to get away from the crowds that followed him. So Julie kind of asked them a little bit of why he might have been tired. But think about it. Crowds were following him everywhere. And that wasn't a bad thing. It was something that he'd sort of wanted in a certain way. But imagine being followed. Teach me, heal me, save us from Rome. All the things that he was being asked of, all the ways in which he was being asked to do and say and heal and touch and do and teach, and all of that can be very exhausting. Where are my teachers out here, right? You spend a day, when I was a teacher, Friday nights were tough. People would be like, let's go out Friday night. I'd be like, no, Saturday. Because Friday night, I'm tired after 5 full days with 35 kids that were 6th graders in a classroom. And so Jesus, I think, as he is taking them out onto this boat, again, maybe his way of getting some rest, maybe his only way of getting away from the crowds, right? He calls them to live, I think, in that liminal space between one landmass and the other. He probably needed a break. He probably was tired. But I think he also was trying to teach them a little bit of a lesson. I remember the last mission trip I did with our youth at my last church. Of course, we went through COVID for a few years, and we thought it was over to some extent. Remember that moment where you're like, oh, it's over now? And so about 2 summers ago, we went on a mission trip to Memphis. And aside from the fact that going to Memphis in the summer is a terrible idea because it is so hot, it was also still a little bit of COVID time, right? It was not quite a week, and I'll tell you why in a second. And it was supposed to be a full week. But it was a good number of days of me exclusively being in charge. 12 kids, 2 other adults, answering questions, making sure we were all fed on time, making sure we were getting where we needed to go, being woken up by trouble and sickness, sleeping on an air mattress. I looked at the church and I'm like, you're welcome. I'm sleeping on an air mattress for a week. And I can tell you that by the end of that, I was exhausted. I thought, I can't speak another wise word. I can't make another decision. I don't care what you're eating. Eat a donut. I don't know, by the last day. Stick a fork in me, I was done. But in fact, that's the trip that I got COVID. So people ask me, did you ever get COVID? That's the story we have to tell ourselves and are asked about. And so I got COVID, and what I say to the church back where I was is, I got COVID, you're welcome. So here's what happened. You see, amongst all the other challenges of our first mission trip after COVID, it was a looming threat. On the 5th day, every day we would test all the kids and all the adults, every single day. 2 had to drop out. So originally it was going to be about 16 of us, and 2 had to drop out, 2 kids and an adult, because before we left, they had COVID, right? So we were testing every day, and on the 5th day, guess what happened? COVID struck. So we left early. I rented a car. 2 kids tested positive for COVID, and I drove them the 8 hours home to Dallas by myself. We all wore masks the whole time, and the other adults got into the van with the other kids, and by the way, they never got COVID. So I took one for the team, I like to say. I was like, I had to get everyone home. But I can tell you that it was a rough trip back. I was pretty tired. And we're asking parents to meet us, and it's been COVID, and there's been communication. And then my beloved adult, who was having to drive the van because I couldn't drive the van, was, even though there's navigation, what I would say wasn't so much like a navigator, got totally lost on the way home. So here I am, masked up with the 2 kids that I'm rushing off to leave with their parents because they have COVID. Do I have COVID now? I don't know if I have COVID now. But what I do have is 10 cars of parents looking at me like, where are my kids? You said to meet us at church right now. And I'm texting, yeah. Greg, are you here? Are you coming? What's going on? What's happening? And I can tell you that at the end of that long day, after the end of a long 5 days, I was done. Could not do it a moment longer. It was a lot. So I feel like I can somewhat relate. I don't think I necessarily have the weight of the world on my shoulders, although, can I get an amen for those of us who sometimes feel like we do, right? Sometimes. I can relate to Jesus being exhausted and wanting to get away. Jesus loved people, but he was also human. So Jesus loved people like we love people, but sometimes he maybe didn't necessarily like people. Just in some ways, right? In some ways of demandingness and tiredness. Because it's draining to be around people who need you to make decisions and help you do this and help you do that, right? I think he needed to reboot and rewind and sort of restock his energy for the journey ahead. Our kids talked about it, right? You take a nap, you take a break, because your body isn't meant to do everything all at once. Sometimes we need to restore ourselves. And so Jesus needed a self-care moment. We'll unpack that a little bit tomorrow night. A nap, right? And I've always mused over 2 moments in the story, right? I've always kind of questioned these 2 moments. How did Jesus sleep through such a bad storm? Did anyone wonder that? Why are they waking him up? Was he just a super heavy sleeper? Was he that, tired? I guess if you're that tired, you will sleep through it. Was the storm maybe not as bad and they were kind of panicking? And what did the disciples think Jesus was going to do about it anyway, right? Weren't some of them fishermen? Couldn't they figure out some of this boat stuff? But in a very practical way, what we see of them is they are in a crisis, a real crisis. And since it was Jesus' idea in the first place to get in the boat, right, it was up to him to fix it. Can you hear them now? I can hear them. I know I don't know. They didn't record what happened on the boat, and I feel like when I get to heaven, I'm going to talk to Peter about this a little bit, but I feel like these are the conversations that were going on. Wow, look at those clouds coming so quickly, and the wind is picking up. My gosh, I knew it was a bad idea that we got in this boat, but Jesus said, let's get in the boat and go across the other side, right? I mean, I was against it, right? That storm was getting really bad. I mean, isn't this Jesus' fault for bringing us out here in the first place? I knew we shouldn't do this. I thought we should walk around. Jesus was like, get in the boat. Should we wake Jesus up and make him deal with the situation that he obviously created? Jesus, we're going to drown. Do something, Jesus, we're going to drown. Have you heard things like this when a leader makes a decision? I'm just going to sip on that for a second. What I call the toxic peanut gallery usually needs to make all the comments, don't they? And you find this especially on social media. Someone does something, creates something, builds something, comments on something, writes something, and then people who have, for the most part, no idea what they're talking about like to chime in, right? And critique and comment and crush it and go, well, and this and that. So it's no different then than it is now. Struggles and the storms of life can more often than not cause us to fear, and fear can make us do or say things we wouldn't normally do or say, right? Fear or change or struggle. Gosh, when we're confronted with something, sometimes that fear takes hold. In the Gospel of Mark's account, they don't wake him with the cry, we will drown, worst case scenario logic, right? So you see them, and you see they don't wake up Jesus gently and go, Jesus, there's just a storm, which is what we want to know. Storm? No, they say like, we're going to drown, right? They're catastrophizing this, worst case scenario. In Mark, they say, don't you care if we drown, Jesus? And I feel like I've heard that from at least a youth a year when I was a youth pastor. Don't you care that this thing is happening? And I think to fear a storm is normal, but it's also not personal, right? Weather isn't out to get us, although we did confess our own kind of collaboration with some of the catastrophe weather that's happening these days. And I think, obviously, climate change and the things we're talking about are real. But I also think that sometimes we take things personally that are not meant to be personal. I mean, I know we're reaping in some ways what we sow and neglect and destruction of creation, but still a tornado isn't personally attacking us any more than a cold front or a big rainstorm or a snowstorm or a hurricane. But that doesn't stop us from looking to exacerbate our fears and blame someone else. I'll never forget when Pat Robertson blamed all the lesbians for the hurricane, right? And you're just like, what? We want someone to blame. Have you heard this? Or said this? Or thought this? When something happens in your life, have you thought this? God, like, what are you up to? I mean, you got me on this boat, or this decision, or this thing. It's not easy. Now, what are you going to do about this turmoil or tension? What are you going to do about this storm? Have you thought that before? I know I have. This was very convicting to read, because sometimes you'll make a decision and you'll step out in faith like they did on the boat. It's Jesus' idea. It's God's idea. We're here somewhere doing something. And then when everything isn't peachy keen, we go, I know it. This was a bad idea, God. Where are you? And so I think Jesus was probably tired and frustrated that once again, he couldn't be let alone for even a moment to nap. Let that sink in a little bit. I think if when we'd gotten home from the mission trip that night and I'd gone to bed in well-earned rest and I'd gotten an emergency call from one of my youth, I would have probably lost it, right? Like, I need a break. But I think the point of his frustration isn't that they were frustrated, but they were catastrophizing. They were making their circumstances the barometer for how much or little Jesus actually cared about them. Jesus, they cry in a sense, don't you care about us? The storm is picking up. We're going to die. I'm sure he looked at them all and was like, how can you say that? Don't you know me? Don't you know that I love you? That my napping during a storm isn't personal? I'm not doing it to make your life more difficult? I think like toddlers who don't get what we want, or kids who are told no by a parent, we too often scream at God when things go wrong or life hits us with storms. God, why don't you care about us? God, why don't you care about us? I think the cry is pretty normal. Has anyone cried that out loud under a frustrating moment or a sad or scary moment? I think it's pretty normal. But I also think sometimes God goes, this isn't a barometer for how much I care, this situation. I love you, and this situation is happening, and both those things are true. In this scripture, it says he rebukes the storm, Jesus does. It's the same language used when he rebukes demons. It is the thing he says when he is censoring or warning or talking about something to stop what they're doing. But I don't think it's the storm that needs to be rebuked. The storm just needs to be calmed. I think it's their fears that need to be rebuked or censored or warned about. Yes, we will experience struggles and drama and trauma and pain, and it will do a number on us in many ways. And I don't mean to make light of that, right? We will experience hard things. We are not guaranteed perfect lives. We may find ourselves in the midst of turmoil, even while following Jesus faithfully to somewhere he's asked us to go. And we will wonder if Jesus is sleeping at the wheel of our lives. There is a saying in the South, and I don't know if you say it here in the Midwest, but we'd say, Jesus, take the wheel. Have you heard that? Jesus, take the wheel. We'll wonder at times what God is up to when the winds pick up and the waves crash at our feet. And we will more often than not, in our human frailty moments, blame God, blame others, blame anything. When the lesson to be learned is, be careful what you do and say when you are afraid. And most importantly, don't focus your faith on your feelings. I had a friend who used to teach, and he would say that feelings are important. And anytime I preach or talk about feelings, I remind you that feelings are not bad or good, they just are. Right? Feelings are data. Feelings tell us what's meaningful to us, what matters to us when we're angry, when we're scared, when we're sad. It gives us information about our lives. But we shouldn't be led by our feelings. Do you get the difference? Faith is what leads us. Our feelings are what follows. If we're led around simply by our feelings without ever asking ourselves what's going on, our lives become a little erratic. Right? And I think Jesus is saying, calm down, I got this. Don't you know that I have this? And I think what happens to our faith in times of crisis is very important. Someone once said, your faith is like tea. Have you heard this? You don't know how strong it is till it gets in a little hot water. Faith, it turns out, is God's gift to us. It's a gift to even have faith in God. God, of course, reached out to us first. We love God only because God loved us first. And so my question is, where does it go when trials hit? Because the disciples are giving us a perfect look at what sometimes we may do when difficulty strikes. Do we throw it out the window when things are hard? Do we hide it? Do we discard it? Do we catastrophize? Do we question God's love for us? This was hard. Does God even love me? Which is a normal thing to maybe even think about. But the truth is, there will always be storms. There will just always be storms. And you know there will always be storms because we share our prayer requests every single Sunday, don't we? And you know when people have joys, which is lovely, but you also know when people experience loss, pain, diagnoses. People in this room are still grieving the loss of a beloved, right? Storms and difficulties are so normal and a part of life. There will always be storms. But the good news is, and I chatted with Rose at the beginning of this when I walk in, because of course she greets us all. What did you say, Rose, when I talked about storms? There will always be sunshine later. There will always be storms, but there will always be sunshine. There will always be storms, but they will always come to an end. And I think the question and the challenge and the hope that I have for all of us is that we know that it's up to us to make sure that when the storm ends, our faith doesn't end with it. So, my beloveds, be reminded that through the storms, through the ups and the downs, those things aren't telling you that God doesn't love you. They're telling you that life is hard and that we are human and that frailty exists and that difficulty happens and that through it all, God loves you and will always rebuke what needs to be rebuked, calm what needs to be calmed, and you can rest in God's unfailing, passionate, beautiful love for you. May you know that the storms of life are not the end of your faith, but only a challenge, and that God will meet you on the other side. Amen.